everyone to another episode of the Terrain Studio. I'm your host, Sean Morris. On this month's Patreon video, I thought it'd be relatively interesting to revisit one of my previous 3x3 builds. In the wake of the skirmish announcement from Fantasy Flight Games, I think the 3x3 format is going to be a lot more popular, and as such I think builds are going to see an increase. This build that I did was for GenCon 2019. It's entitled the Felucia table. So in this video what I'm going to be doing is walking you through using pictures, both the theory of the build, some of the materials, where I sourced those from, how I used them, and how I went about generally crafting the look of this table. It's quite unique. It was built for demonstration purposes. However, the 3x3 format fits a lot of what I used here, and I think a lot of the craftsmanship and the techniques that went into this could be used in future 3x3 builds for either Star Wars Legion or any other skirmish type game. So without further ado, let's get into the first photo. So the construction of this table involved me building a 3x3 frame. I started off using just some 1x4 lumber. I supported this in the corners as well as under the bottom edge. You'll notice here that it has a slight recess. The reason I did that is I wanted to have some sort of depressions cut into the foam, and as a result I wanted the foam to sit below the outside edge. So I've just done that here using very simple framing technique. I am no woodworker by any means, but this did allow me to have quite a sturdy edge. And additionally, I attached some handles to the table as well, just making it fairly simple for transportation to and from demonstration locations. So here you'll see what I did next was I laid in a 1/2 inch MDF sort of substrate, and this was going to go below the foam. Obviously it's very robust and the foam doesn't need that much support. However, I didn't want to have any depressions in the middle foam, and if you just use foam alone, there's potential that you could have some breakage or cracking, and that would obviously create problems down the road. So I wanted to give it a nice layer at the bottom. It is quite heavy, however, with the attachment of the handles on either side, it made transportation of this project and even moving it around the studio very easy. So if you have the ability, I would recommend having some sort of lifting feature. It's a little hard to get under the corners when it's laying flat on the table, so you want to make sure that you kind of work that into your design. One of the things that I probably would have done differently is I would have made the handles removable from the outside. They were attached via the interior, and the foam actually sits over the attachment points. So in going back and looking at this design again, I would want to have something that I could either attach or detach handles. Perhaps I could just have an accepting socket on the outside that I could screw in a knob or handle, and that would make removal of these very easy. Perhaps storage would be slightly assisted as well if I didn't have any handles protruding on either side. So live and learn with all builds. The next photo here shows just how I went about sketching out some of the designs. So typically I won't do a lot of pre-sketches, but in this one here what I actually did was draw right on the MDF, and what you're seeing here is just some of the topography that I was laying in. These lines encircling the other lines just show you elevation changes, much like you'd see on a topography type map or something similar to that. So the rectangular feature that's up in the left hand corner, that's actually where the bridge was going across. As I went through the design, the bridge got actually extensively larger as I messed around with slope and just kind of messing with the features as I put them in. A lot of the shapes and the work that I do are very organic, so I like to have sort of a template, a paint by numbers if you will. However, I feel that I want to have the need to color outside the lines and sort of change things on the fly. So I think you shouldn't be hemmed in too much to initial designs. You want to definitely use the look and the aesthetics of your build to sort of drive the final product, and I'm definitely a proponent of that. Here in the last sort of preparation photo, you're going to see that the material's all been laid in here. Everything is starting to take shape, and what you see at the top corner that's slightly different than the photo you saw before was me layering in the foam. So here I have 2 1/2 inch layers, and you'll see that brings this foam surface basically level with the exterior, and that's what I wanted to have achieved. I wanted the layer for the foam rather for the most part to be quite protected from the wood. Anything that goes above and beyond that, I will add some additional supports, but having the wood basically protect the outside foam really makes this quite robust, and again lends to transportation. If transportation or moving it around is not really something you have concern with, you probably don't have to go to quite the extent that I have to protect the foam. However, it's always a good idea to protect any of your invested time, and terrain is definitely going to be that. So if you have the ability to sort of secure or create a buffer around that, I highly recommend doing that as well. You can do it with something a little bit less robust than wood. Perhaps thick plastic card or something similar would be just fine. Alright, so the next part in the build process was laying down the layers of foam. As I mentioned before, the first half-inch layer was laid in, and that's recessed below the outside edges. The next thing I started to do was build up the outside edges. For the most of this, I used 1-inch foam, and that's the layer that you kind of see here in the foreground. Then I actually built up some 2-inch layers in the other end, and that's about 3 inches above board height. I wanted to create some artificial height with the table to kind of give it a circular flow. So you're going to notice that there's 4 different elevations effectively. We have the flat layer above the bridge height itself, the lower layer, and then the slope layers that go down under the bridge. It kind of has a cyclical sort of figure 8 pattern as you move around the board. The next photo here just shows kind of the chaotic nature that is kind of involved in the process. So I start with large blocks of foam or sheets, and I sort of work my way carving and cutting into pieces as I go. For this piece, what I did is I actually recessed in the 4-inch section on the right hand side. The 1-inch layer that makes up the left portion, that's laid on top of the base foam. And then the bridge itself, you'll see that I've actually inverted the foam and laminated in the vertical axis to kind of create both strength and to give a wider span. This is really important because you'll notice at the center of the bridge where I've narrowed the foam down considerably. With the laminated foam, this allows me to go a lot thinner. It's very structurally sound. I can put a lot of weight on there. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't have a lot of seams running sort of on the left to right. I wanted to invert the seams because those are a lot easier to hide, especially since you'll be looking down at the top of the bridge for a large portion of this table. This next photo here shows you just a little bit more of that carving process that's occurring. Here you'll see that I have the slope on the right hand side has not yet been touched, so it's still quite vertical in shape. The one on the left hand side has begun to be carved away, some more aggressive than others. This will get a nice rounding. I'll use a sanding block in here to sort of carve away these real angular cuts, but you kind of get the idea that I'm going for a sort of a sloped edge over there and a couple steps along the way. You'll notice on the bridge as well, where you can see those laminated surfaces now a little bit more clearly, that I've also carved the bridge going both north and south. So there's a little bit of a convex shape to the bridge itself. It just gives it a little bit more character and allows it to look a little bit more subtle and sort of flow into the outside edges. This will become a little bit more clear as we move on and start adding some of the texture and the pastes in as well. You can see now that I've considerably cleaned up the foam that's on the table. You're going to notice that there's a lot more of a smooth transition between both the bridge and the elevations, as well as the lower level elevation and the bottom of the table. This was just achieved through a series of sanding, moving progressively down to around a 400 grit sandpaper. You're also going to notice that there's some other sort of island type elevations that are added. These are just designed to give a little bit of elevation to the bottom level, bringing it sort of up to the main level of the table. Additionally, you're going to notice that there's these sort of conical shaped tree stump rock-like structures. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but I know that I've seen them in several reference photos for Felucia. How I achieved these was by stacking up sort of round or somewhat round shapes of foam, and then I used the hot wire foam cutter blade to just actually burn in these, moving around in a clockwise-like fashion just to create these sort of striations. I then either angle cut the bottom or left them vertical and then placed them on the table. These are not glued in place at this moment. I have a little bit more work to do. But what I do in this process, and I'll talk about it a lot, is I do a lot of dry fitting. And that's basically just staging the table continuously as I build to really see if the pattern or the direction that I'm going is going to stay true. One example of this would be the conical shapes that you see on top of the bridge elevation in the top right corner. You'll notice that in the final rendition of this table, that has been slightly rotated and moved. You'll also notice a couple other things are very subtle and move around a little bit. Additionally, in this photo, what you're going to notice is that there's going to be some plastic gray tubes that you can see. Pieces of plastic tubing, as I mentioned, are designed to be receptacles for these very vertical plants. You'll notice that the height of these pieces of plant-like material are significantly above almost every other feature on the table. The reason that I added these receptacles was to give them a little bit of added strength. If they were only recessed a ½ inch, they'd be very fragile and would move around considerably. Now that they have the ability to sink all the way down to the MDF, these are really, really strong. Additionally, I drilled into the MDF a little bit just to give them that added support. This is a really neat item because I'm able to actually take these plants out to drop the height down for shipping as well as storage and other things like that. Additionally, you can move these plants if they impede gameplay at any point and easily relocate or index them back so there's no shifting of the material while gameplay is going on. You're also going to notice that the plants are starting to add to the table as we move through the photos. A lot of these plants are not permanently secured, nor will they ever be. The reason for this is that obviously securing plants at this stage really impede the remaining processes. Texture, ground cover, painting, all of those features. But as I mentioned before, I do a lot of this work to really keep a pulse of the build. How are things looking both visually and from a gameplay standpoint? Again, as I mentioned, this is a demo table. Always have to be keeping those things in mind. Regardless of the height or the size of the plant, as you can see, this really amoeboid shape plant takes up a significant amount of real estate. However, given the vertical nature and the upward turn nature of the plant leaves, I can still get in and around this quite easily with figures. It adds a lot to the vertical height of the table without detracting a lot from the footprint. It should come as no surprise that adding color to a Felucia table is definitely one of the more eye-catching elements. As I'm progressing through the dry fit stage here, you can see that I'm progressively adding more and more color. Here I've added a little bit of green plant works just to sort of almost mute the tones of the very bright and vibrant plants. You're also going to notice that there's some variations of the same plant. We have these real blue egg-like structures as well as these yellow dome ones. These are quite unique. I don't have any actual work in progress photos of the domes, but let me kind of explain what they are. These domes are actually Christmas balls, or you can also use them to make bath bombs. There's plants on the inside of this, and what I've done is, in both cases, I've actually frosted the inside using a matte varnish. What I did is I take an aerosol matte varnish, spray it on the inside. If you don't allow it to air dry, but rather apply heat via a hairdryer, you can actually frost the inside of the glass. And that's how I got these this sort of smoky or sort of fogged look. And you'll notice that the plants are sort of peeking through, but you can't see a lot of detail. This is quite nice if you want to hide maybe a more plastic-like plant. Plants are one consideration that people need to make when considering a Felucia table, and I want to get something out of the way right away. Aquarium plants are great. However, and this was said a lot of times when I showed photos of work in progress, the bulk of these plants do not come from aquarium stores, nor are they geared towards aquarium use. In fact, a lot of these plants come from floral stores. Floral plants tend to be quite a bit more expensive, and the reason being is they're of a higher quality. A lot of these plants are rubberized in nature rather than plastic. That really helps on the back end when you're trying to make things look realistic. Trying to take off a plastic look or to change or transform a very plasticized plant becomes very difficult. So I tend not to use a lot of those. Using fabric or rubberized plants is a little bit easier. They do take a lot more work to get paint to stick to them, and there is a little bit more on the preparation side. Rather, there isn't a bit more, there's a bit of a different process in preparing. You definitely don't have to trim as much plastic and things like that off plants. What you do need to do is you need to make sure that they are stable and they are stable enough to be used for gameplay. Floral plants and arrangements are typically used as standalone pieces that you're not going to be interfering or interacting with very much. Because of that, you have to make sure that things are very, I'd say, structurally sound. So there was a lot of application process in terms of getting, especially these vertical plants that you see here. These layers had to be secured with epoxy, and in between that, significant amount of drying time had to occur. The same thing with attaching the plasticized balls to those rubberized plants. It did take some R&D in terms of finding the proper adhesive, but what I found out was that two-part epoxy was by far the best and only solution that I could get to work, and I did go through a number of those. So if you're going to attempt to use any of these rubber or fabric plants, I'm going to give you a tip and use two-part epoxy. Don't use any of your standardized hobby glues or PVAs. They just won't have the structural stability to hold these things together. Once I achieved that, however, I was absolutely astounded with the results and couldn't be more pleased. So a little bit of R&D on the back end really truthfully gave me another tool in the toolbox as I move forward. Hopefully you guys will have to do a lot less work and be able to apply that on your own tables. Following the structural elements being laid in with foam, it was time to start adding texture. For this project, I chose to use a sand layer for the topmost layer, leaving the exposed pink here for the ground layer. So this was going to be a much more of a upturned earth type look. I wasn't going to use the sand color as it's laid here, but I wanted the texture of this just to differentiate from the bottom layer. This was actually going to get a fine layer of grass and have some vegetation on it. And it also primarily houses most of the plants. So you'll see kind of why I went with this much more muted flat tone. The texture itself, as I said, was play sand. Actually, in this specific instance, I used what's referred to as reptilian sand in some cases, and it's a very fine grit sand. I like it. I've used it on a few other projects, including the Geonosis project, because of its fine grit, and it's very consistent. So you don't have to do any sifting or anything like that like you will with a traditional play sand that you might purchase at a hardware store. So that's quite important. It's a little bit more expensive, however, it's relatively cheap, so it's inexpensive of a material to use. You just can't get it in the bulk quantities that you may purchase play sand in. For the application here, what I used is Weld Bond. I did thin it out a little bit with scenic cement. Be careful not to thin things out with water specifically for this. Water will evaporate really quickly, and I needed to make sure I had a very consistent level layer of the sand. I didn't want to have any depressions, and because this sand is so fine grit, it will pick up any depressions or imperfections in your foam. So if you have any chips or dings or bangs or anything like that, you'll probably want to use a little bit of foam putty to fill in any of those areas. I did use some foam putty on the transitions just to make sure that they flowed a little bit nicer. And you'll also notice that I brought the sand texture down onto the bottom layer. However, subsequently in the next following sequence, I will actually backfill that, so that layer will disappear when I add the ground paste in. The close-up shot here shows you the fine texture that I was talking about. You'll notice that it went perfectly over the plastic receptacles for the other plants. It marries up very nicely to the foam conical shapes here. It goes over the top. It's a really nice material to work with. So I do advise, if you are looking for a nice sand for any type of hobby material, this is a pet store item that I will highly recommend. It does come in a variety of colors. This is the color I happen to have for other projects. I use this on the Scarif table as well. It does paint up very nicely. You can airbrush this. You can even dry brush it, although as you can see there's very little differentiation in the texture. Nonetheless, it still picks up a dry brush quite nicely. The next step in the project was the most labor-intensive step of the entire build. The process itself is not overly complex, however there is some skills that are required, primarily working with different materials here and knowing kind of the properties of those that would be advantageous to know at this point. The materials that I used for this were AK Interactive's mud mixture. I used both the coarse and the medium textures. I mixed them together. I didn't add any additional ballast because I felt that the texture of the material itself out of the container was adequate. However, when I was spreading it out, I did notice that the dry time for this product is considerably longer than the Vallejo earth texture that I've traditionally used on other projects. The end result I was equally satisfied with, just keeping in mind that the dry time, as I said, was considerably longer. To avoid having extensive dry times, what I was very careful was to make sure that it didn't have any artificial buildup. Building up density just to add material is not advantageous. Not only that, it's going to cause you to waste materials. So it's very important that you're spreading it out to an equal consistency. That being said, it gets a little bit difficult to know exactly how thick things are. One of the advantageous parts of this build was I was able to use the outside perimeter, the wood perimeter, as a gauge. So I was able to kind of use that as a guide to sort of level out and bevel my density of the materials to ensure that I didn't have, as I said, any artificial buildups. You'll notice as you look here at the surface of the build that you'll see some pockets and some deformations within the mixture. And that just adds a lot of character to the build. So that I would expect. Ground cover is very seldom perfectly flat or even. One of the things I had to be very careful of though was I didn't have a lot of trowel marks as I used my tools to flatten it out. In order to avoid this or to kind of create some sort of uniformity within the ground texture without showing up my tool marks was that I used a foam sponge. I had to though wait several hours before I was able to sponge this surface. If I tried to apply it early and what happened was I just caked up the sponge and actually lifted off more material than anything else. So I was very, very careful. In this next sort of close-up image, you can kind of see where there's a little bit of troweling marks, but then you can also see where there's some flat points, some more dense or density of the grit, and you can see how it's flowed up onto the sand. And I sort of just use that transition to sort of bevel those two surfaces together. It looks a little stark, and obviously you can see the moisture within the material here. So when you're working with this material, it's very evident when it is dry because the shine comes off it, and it has a very much more of a matte finish. So that's quite important when you're working with the material, just to kind of keep in mind. I do advise when you are working with things to not mix in too many different materials. I did add some pigment and some paint to this to kind of give the texture and the look that I was going for. However, I actually think that I increased the dry time based on the additional materials that I added because when I did subsequent pre-tests and I didn't add color, I found that it dried substantially faster. So just keep that in mind if you're going to add any additives or add any moisture or liquids to a material, you're likely going to increase the dry time. In this case, it was quite evident that it took a considerably longer amount of time to dry. As the lower surface began to dry, and you can see here it's sort of somewhat dry, I moved over to starting to paint the upper surface. What I wanted to do for the upper surface was I wanted to choose a color that almost looked like the base layer, but more in a dry format. So it had the same sort of undertones, those brown tones, those earthy tones. However, it was a little bit more sun-baked, a little bit more exposed. It also is, in theory, closer to the source of light. Therefore, it's naturally going to be a little bit more light in appearance. The stuff that is next to the clear sand color, you'll notice that that is considerably more tan and bright. As you transition over the bridge to the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that material is a little bit more dry, and it's a little bit more close to the somewhat drying material on the lower end. As we transitioned into the next one, which is just kind of a reverse photo, you can see that color shifts a little bit. It's a little bit lighter than the previous photo. That's just because the object is closer to the light source that I'm using, but you can kind of definitely see those undertones of the base layer and how we've kind of created almost a shadow-like look with just using the paint here. As we add more plant material and that will start bulking out, we'll get some artificial shadows from those as well. So this is a fairly fairly straightforward process, but I did want to talk about how it is important to select appropriate colors, not only in the painting stage, but you have to kind of make considerations for what will this look like when I start adding in my ground materials, my plant materials, or any other materials that I'm going to add on top of this. It still needs to look good at all stages, except as you step through these processes, you have to kind of envision a step ahead or 2 steps ahead. This is another reason why I like to do a lot of dry fitting. I'm able to pay attention to where my heavy shadow areas are going to be based on the materials that I'm going to add later, and what areas are going to be much more exposed that I'm going to have to make some considerations for, and you'll see in the next upcoming steps exactly what those considerations will be. Now that the ground texture and paint has fully cured and dried, you can see that our earth textures, both the upper and lower portions, are much more in sync. We have a definite dry layer on top, we have a much more rugged or texturized surface on the bottom. However, the colors themselves are fairly close in nature. This is quite important for laying the groundwork, if you will, for the subsequent steps. We wanted to make sure that our transitions between the layers was not too stark, yet at the same time when we add our subsequent materials, we were able to create some sort of differentiation between both the upper and lower portions. This effect proved to be a little bit more difficult in nature in terms of getting some uniformity between the upper portions. The entirety of the surface was actually given a brown sepia wash. The lower portion, however, was not. And then what I ended up doing on the top was I ended up sponging off the material quite rapidly in order to create some, again, shadow and high points within this. So what I did is I concentrated the sponging to any of the layers that were going to be more exposed ground, leaving the other layers in the transition points and around the columns and the bridge to be a little bit darker in nature. It's a little difficult to pick this up in this particular photo. However, I think it becomes much more evident as we move into the subsequent layers. This photo here, although singular in nature, has a lot going on, so let me just take a moment to explain. You can definitely see the contrasting nature of both the saturated and the undersaturated points now. The exposed high points are very evident. As I mentioned, they are primarily concentrated into the flats or the wide open spaces, top of the bridge and amongst the columns. And as we transition down to the lower portion, you can see there's a distinct difference between the lower portion and the upper section now. This is further accentuated, if you will, with the grass that's been added. For this particular project, I didn't want to have any sort of coarse turfs, so I used 2 types of fine turf. In this case here, what I applied is my go-to color. It's called Earth Blend, and it's by Woodland Scenics. This is the much more olive tone that you see. That was the first layer that I put down, and I put it down in a fairly high concentration. You don't actually see a lot of it feathered out in the edges. However, if we were to zoom in, and you'll see it in subsequent photos, it actually transitions in with the brown and actually picks up quite nicely with it. So it transitioned into the lower section. It's definitely highly concentrated on the islands, as well as around the columns and around the base of the bridge. Additionally, though, what I went down in with this is I did a yellow tone. The specific color is a beige, and I used that on top, and this was to create some density and some high points. So the highest points look very yellow in color, almost dead grass-like, with the olive definitely shining through as one of the most prominent colors. It does transition off into the browns quite nicely, and then it's further highlighted by the fact that there is these tanned sections on the table. This all plays very nicely in the final project. It's quite stark and highlighted in this particular photo, but as we transition through, you're going to see that the effect is much more subtle than this photo would allude to. Before we get back into the table itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about plant preparation and some of the variations that you can create with a fairly limited palette of plants. I would say that the plant palette for this particular project was not limited at all, and there was actually a number of plants that I selected and didn't use. That was just come down to the cosmetics of the build, the color contrasts that I was looking for. But I did want to talk about how you can take a relatively simple or small palette and accentuate it through color or contrast, or just simply using the materials in other ways than straight application. I wanted to focus in on the lilies for a second. These lilies at this point you've seen have only been white. However, they were fairly simple to contrast and make them very much more Felucian in nature. For these particular plants, what I did is I used a green ink by Liquitex, and I simply just airbrushed it over the petals of the plant, and you can see that it picked up and highlighted. These specks were actually a natural occurrence of the ink saturating in at different concentrations, as opposed to me actually putting these in. And so what I did is I had a heavier concentration near the base of the plant, and I transitioned that obviously right up to the very tips, where you can see that the translucent nature of the material itself really accentuated and add that really iridescent look to this plant. Likewise, speaking of iridescence, I used gamer's grass tufts throughout this project. They have a very electric blue color, and that's seen here at the lower portion of the image. But as the photo transitions to the top, you're going to notice that there's a subtle color and hue shift here. This was achieved by airbrushing, just subsequently brighter or lighter and lighter layers, until I achieved some very contrasting blues as well as some teal seen here in this final image. In addition, you can see some of the plants here in their various forms of preparation. Some of them are simply pulled right off the sprig. Others needed to be have a little bit of flash cleaned up, and then some of them still further have been completely transformed, as in the case of this tall sort of shiska plant here, if you will, as I've placed it on this long dowel and added some of the previous discussed frosting and the globes that have been added. The purple one that's seen here, that is one example of an aquarium plant, and you can see the very plasticized nature of that. This plant ended up working quite nicely with very little prep work. However, I did need to take some matte sealer just to tone down the plastic look of that. This very large flower plant is one of the only plants that I used on the table with almost zero preparation. This one had a very nice color shift that came naturally from it. However, I would caution about plants like this, in the sense that this plant here was actually $17. And I use that number only to explain that the higher priced floral plants and the arrangements that you can sometimes purchase sort of pre-done are definitely going to have a lot more work into them, but as such they're going to have a higher price tag attached. So that's just something to kind of think about in terms of budget and planning. Sometimes plants will have a great look, and you can pay the premium price for it, obviously, because you're paying for the craftsmanship. There's other plants perhaps that you can get at a lower price point that, with just a little bit of effort, a little bit of paint, and a little bit of elbow grease, you can get them to look quite nice and probably save yourself a few dollars. These very spiky blue plants here are a nice transition, or I guess a medium choice. They're not too cheap, however, they're not too expensive either. I did have to do a little prep work. It was a little bit of airbrushing just to get them to fit the motif that I was looking for here. So please choose your plants in accordance with your palette, and it's not a lot of time to spend researching and looking around. I did a couple pre-scouting shopping trips just to sort of take a lay of the land of what was available, and then I went back. I actually took photos of everything while I was shopping. I went back and laid out my palette just so that I wasn't purchasing a bunch of plants that I didn't want to use. Even though I did the pre-planning work, I still purchased some that I didn't use on this particular build. However, I do think I'll be able to find some use for them down the road. But just a cautionary tale that you don't need to snatch up everything that you see just because you get inspired at that very moment. It's okay to kind of take some time, collectively plan out sort of your plan of attack or the biome that you're trying to create, and then go back and purchase. It's just a lesson that I've learned throughout my time of building, and I wanted to share that with you guys. As I mentioned previous, plant selection was a very pivotal part of this build process. In addition to the plants themselves, I had to carefully select some transitional elements. The transitional elements needed to take the project from the isolated plant pockets into the open spaces while not creating any sort of heavy segmentation. One of the things that I also had to keep in mind during this build was the fact that it was a demonstration board, and as such I needed to preserve a lot of the play space. With new players or the casual gamer interacting with this, I needed to make sure that it was subtle enough to create the overall look while not interfering with casual gameplay or the teaching elements. So this was quite important, and it took me a while to sort of select how exactly I wanted to go about doing this process. I ultimately settled on using the grass tufts in addition to a couple stone elements, and you'll see these kind of colored stones sort of permeated throughout. I like the stones because they kind of accentuated that iridescent look that I was going for. They were also a very low feature, and they also played well with the color choices that I had. So as we look and scroll through these photos, you're going to notice that the predominant ground elements are either in the purple, blue, or pink shades. And I used the Gamer's Grass Tufts again to achieve this with a combination of airbrushing and the sort of natural products that they produce to kind of create that look. However, in addition, if you're looking quite carefully, I also added in a few other elements. I used some off yellows, some bright yellows, as well as some bright greens. The reason I chose to do this was I had a few yellow elements as well as some oranges, and I picked some off tones just to sort of tie those colors together. I didn't have any orange grass tufts, nor did I want to use that because I wanted to have some standalone colors as well, some of those real splash or poppy elements, and I thought orange was a nice one to kind of leave isolated. Additionally, we had a lot of the leafy greens that were kind of predominant. I sort of used those as almost a filler plant, and I scattered those throughout the entire table. However, I wanted to bring a nice bright green element down onto the table itself and transition that as well. So you'll notice that there's the occasional green or lime green splash of grass tuff. I also used a leafy grass tuff that was slightly different than the other ones, just again to tie in that leafy element and to give it a little variation as I colored and sprinkled that in. Finally, predominantly around the pathway or over the bridge, you'll notice that I used some dry grass. This is actually a winter or dead grass, and this again just tied in with those olive elements, that earth blend from Woodland Scenics that I used on the ground cover, and again just sort of accentuated the pathway, defined some of the perimeters between the vegetation as well as the open spaces. So truthfully, everything was designed to not be overpowering, to play off one another, and truthfully accent each of the major elements. So again, those teal plants, those purple and pink color splashes, as well as I used some small low-lying plants as well. So you'll see a lot of these sort of alien-esque fern-like plants scattered throughout the low sections. A couple other important things to point out around the placement and selection of these plants. You'll notice in some sections the plant grass tufts never leave the perimeter or the overhang of the surrounding plant elements. In other sections, it's like a finger-like projection protruding past the perimeter and sort of shooting out into the open elements. I strategically did this in certain areas just to sort of tie in each of the standalone elements, predominantly around the little island pieces that were placed on the lower section. With the overhang of the bridge going, spanning across the entirety of the table, I wanted to sort of accent or highlight the edge of this element. I wanted to kind of downplay the rounded element of the bridge, and so on here, where I used the dead grass and the greens and a few of the light pinks, just to tie in a little bit of color. You'll also notice there's a few mushrooms overhanging some of the bridge elements and a few of the columns, and that was just again just to add a little bit of an accent and bring a little bit of the brown, just so I didn't have those stark contrast of those sort of blank sides. That was just one other additional element. I tried to creep up some of the plants along those as well. So it was just a combination of different techniques, different colors, really kind of just to tie all this vegetation together. As we move into the final photos and we move into some different lighting, I just want you guys to sort of take in all of the sort of steps along the way. I'm hoping that nothing sticks out to be overly powerful or predominant. However, each element should draw your eye at one point or another, and that's kind of how this whole table plays. You can look at it from all kinds of angles, notice different things, and truthfully, it's designed to give you a nice aesthetic appeal. It's really designed to capture that alien-esque environment that Felucia is kind of known for, and really have that poppy color that's going to look great, particularly in this case because they were playing the Clone Wars release on the table, and I really think that played well. And we have some photos at the end, so hopefully you guys will enjoy those as well. So as we walk through the final photos of this build, again, I just wanted your eye to be drawn to all the elements. They're all now brought together. You'll notice that the lilies have sort of transitioned into this teal look. We have the really tall bulbous plants now added with that orange splash. They were actually given a final brush of a brown just to tone them down a little bit again, bring them in a little bit more in alignment with the ground cover. You're also going to notice that I added in some of these orange, these bright orange balls around the base of those. They were sort of designed to be sort of the sprouts of these trees, if you will, kind of the precursor to these larger faunal plants growing up. I added in a few green rather, succulents throughout the base as well as these sort of cactus-like ones kind of protruding from some of the top of those stumps that were there. I just wanted to add a little bit of variation. I didn't want to have all of them be blank and open. At the same time, I didn't want to cover them all in either. You'll also notice as we transition over the bridge that I filled in a lot of the underbelly of these larger plants, just using a combination of green ferns as well as additional purple and pink plants. It was really super fun to kind of bring everything back together. As I mentioned, I dry fit a lot, but as I was adding in these plants, I started to, finally solidify them in place, gluing and pressing them into the sections. Anything that was above the threshold of the bridge itself is actually removable, and again, that makes it really easy for transportation and storage, as well as reaching and picking up dice and things like that, or trying to get a line of sight declaration done. It's a little bit easier to kind of move that. You can get your head down to surface level as you can move and navigate around there. You'll also notice these little red protrusion plants that I put on there. I noticed that there was some farming that occurred on Felucia, and it looked like they farmed these sort of red plants. I'm not exactly sure of the name, but I thought they looked the part, so I added in just a small patch of that, and you'll notice that I protruded that out, but of course in doing so I take up a little real estate, so I wanted to use that element quite sparingly, and I only did that in one section. The green really pops when we add all the colors together, so hopefully you guys are noticing that. And that sort of filler-like plant, although it may seem like it's a little bit standoffish in terms of not being as an exciting of a color, it truthfully does add a nice transition between all the other color splashes, and that's something that I really pay attention to as well. Even filler elements, I don't consider them after effects. In fact, they're a prime consideration as I'm building everything, because ultimately you do need to make sure that you're covering over any underexposed areas. In this case, I had a lot of stems and things as I was creating some artificial elevation, and stems get quite boring, so you can use these filler plants to kind of help fill those spaces in. These last 5 or 6 photos are truly what this build is all about. The first one just shows us setting it up at GenCon. This is prior to the crowds getting a chance to come in and see it. We are really proud to see it displayed at the FFG booth, and we're eager with anticipation of how players may interact and what their thoughts were about the table. There's no Clone Wars models on this yet, but we were really looking forward to seeing how they would jive with our look and how the color splashes of the clones and droids would look. We didn't have a lot of chance to get photos because we were very busy during that time, but we did manage to snap a couple photos. And anything that we had taken looks really, really good. Of course, we have the very iconic battle here of Kenobi versus Grievous as they approach each other across the pass, and you can see some droids in the background. It's a really fun shot, and I think it truthfully captures the theme of this table. Additionally, here we have another photo as they kind of approach each other. I think a lot of the players who got a chance to demonstrate or take a demo of this board really looked forward to that engagement there. Another thing that we really noted about the board is players really interacted well with the elevation changes. So that, again, that figure eight pattern of the going over the bridge, going under the bridge, and moving from the high and low points really played out well for the players. And I think that transitioned quite well from concept to actual play experience. Here we have a final shot of just two players getting a demonstration from my good friend Joe DePinto here as they engaged. I watched these two guys. They seem to be having a great time. Clearly friends, but clearly the friendship was put on hold during this battle as they played each other. And the whole weekend I saw a lot of this replicating of player experience, having a really good time. Lots of great comments. I was in and out as I was seeing people interact. I kind of like to stay in the background on this stuff, but I was really curious to hear what people thought about it, and it was overly positive in terms of what I received, and I was really happy to see that. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. I know it's a little different style of video, but hopefully you guys have got some inspiration. That's truthfully what these are about. If there's any technical elements or anything that you need to see in video format, please of course put those in the comments. I'd be more than happy to create a specific tutorial around any one of these elements. So as always, I very much appreciate all my patrons. I appreciate you guys sticking with me on the channel here. All your comment, your continued support really makes this stuff possible. So I'll catch you guys in the next video, and thanks for watching. Cheers.